Welcome back to the Wounds to Wisdom podcast. I am your host, Sarah Carell, and we are talking about the Wounds to Wisdom Healing Through Veteran and First Responder Narratives book that's coming out in August. And I am thrilled to be able to interview all 29 of the authors on this mini series they're sharing their stories of trauma and how they got out of it, how they were able to navigate their way to healing. So today I am so happy to be able to just welcome Barry Zworestine on the podcast today. And Barry he's a fascinating guy. He fought in the Rhodesian War. He's a combat veteran, and he's also been a psychologist for the last 20 years. He is the author of Which Way is Your Warrior Facing? An operational manual for current serving and veterans transitioning into civilian life. And all of us on The Power of Our Story appreciate Barry so much because he is so passionate about helping our veterans and first responders navigate through the transitioning process, even the process of retirement. Both can be very difficult. He pulls in also the family members because they're transitioning too. So Barry, it's wonderful to have you, with me here today and have this conversation. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. It's always a pleasure to hang out with you, and being a part of the Power of Your Story, Power of Our Story has been just the most wonderful experience. So thanks for today, and also thanks for everything you've done to make this book a possibility.
Oh, it is an absolute honor. It's so moving to me to hear all these stories. People are being so incredibly generous. And, our whole goal is that if there is a protector out there that is suffering in silence, they can borrow your courage. They can borrow your courage, believe there's hope to heal and to have a new life. So, Barry, I would love to hear a little of your backstory before we get into your passion and your reason for wanting to share your story. So, where did you come from, and a little bit about your childhood?
So I was born in 1953 in Southern Rhodesia, which was a British colony. So our currency was pounds, shillings, and pence, and we stood up for God Save the Queen in school. And then I think it was in 1979, our Prime Minister broke away from being a British colony and declared UDI, which was a Unilateral Declaration of Independence. And from 1965. And soon after, Britain declared sanctions because they weren't too amused with us. But, we were pretty good. They often used to say what we couldn't get anymore, we learned to make. And that could be clothing, chocolates, machinery, vehicles, and what we couldn't do, we stole. So we were an incredibly inventive nation of people. And the war began in the 60s. It was a bush war because Rhodesia is surrounded by 4 countries, South Africa underneath us, and then we've got Botswana, Zambia, and Mozambique on top of us, on sort of left, right, and on top. And terrorists started flooding in from the borders. It wasn't an urban warfare. They started coming in, trying to take over villages, and I think with China in tow behind them, the goal was that eventually they would take over the country because we were known as the breadbasket of Africa. We lost the war eventually, and in 1979 we changed to a transitional government under a guy called Abel Muzorewa, and that lasted from 79 to 80 for the year. There were elections. 1980 became Zimbabwe, run by Robert Mugabe, who now, thank God, has passed, and literally took what was one of the wealthiest countries in Africa into a complete dust bowl. So, I remember growing up, my father was patrolling the streets with rusty old 303s with a group of men. Some homes had grenade screens on the walls. And every day we would turn on the news, and I just remember the news starting with security forces regret to announce the death in action of the following. And there was a minimum of, almost 5 people a day being killed. I went to government school. I was not an academic. I was a gymnast, and I was on the first team squash, so good at sports, not hot at the academics. I'll probably describe myself as quite an introvert in those days. And then I was at university from 72 to 75, did a degree in English and sociology, became a teacher because my parents felt there was really nothing else I could do, which was a major mistake. Swore I would never go into high school, so that was 4 years down the drain. Then after 4 years of study, I got called up to the Rhodesian Bush War. So 1976, I went in. I thought I'd do the officer selection course, but which is ridiculous because I have some learning issues, and one of those was a zero sense of direction, which is actually quite pathological. So made it to the third day of the initial selection when I dislocated a shoulder from a gymnastics injury, and then went for 3 months and trained as a medic. Went to my company on the Mozambique border, and we were allocated into 4-man sticks and patrolled for 7 months. Our territory on the Mozambique border was quite intense. Terrorists walked in groups of 30 to 300, and one of our sticks actually walked into 300 at one point. And a lot of it, was just, it was a very different kind of a war. It's not like we look today, but it was short shorts, running shoes, brown T-shirt, and then with everything draped around you. And we'd literally go into the bush for 7 to 10 days and carry the food we needed, and did what we had to do. So eventually I had enough. I went back to university, and the rest of my life followed. But I had a good upbringing. I mean, my dad was a Romanian. He came out before the war as a 12-year-old, never saw his mother again, briefly saw his father. He could have been a really good accountant, but, he had no money. And he had a little bottle store and a grocery shop and worked really hard all his life. My mother was a speech and drama teacher and had a little school, and, we lived well. Had a beautiful home, and we used to go out to the farm. My father was a farmer for a while. His uncle was a farmer. So we'd spend a lot of time out there. So Rhodesia was an amazing life. I mean, very outdoor, because there was no TV and no internet, nothing like that. And it was a great lifestyle. We all lived within virtually one neighborhood. And so it was good. It was a good life. And then the rest followed, Sarah.
That is fascinating to me. And I'm curious too. I appreciate you sharing that, because I think a lot of us don't know about that war. We don't know much.
No.
So were you drafted?
No.
Is that what I just heard? When you said you were called up, does that mean you were drafted?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was compulsory. So
compulsory.
Guys were going in from the age of 17. Oh yeah, it was compulsory. Everybody had to do it. If you didn't go in, you were not allowed to return to your country. So a lot of people gapped it, went to South Africa or overseas, and they never returned. It was probably a good thing I came back a bit more mature. But yeah, it was a difficult war, and really, and that's why it's called the Bush War, because it was literally in bush.
Gosh. And I'm imagining your story. Okay, so you're drafted at a young age, and you're in a stick, which is 4 of you, right?
4 of us.
Is that usually about 4? And sometimes you're dealing with 300 terrorists. So this is something that you were called up to do. It's just amazing to me, like how intense that must have been. And eventually you lost your country. You were a man without a country, on top of seeing all the horrors that you did, on top of not actually choosing to serve at that time, but it was a draft. So I would imagine that might be a different attitude, possibly. Did you get a lot of training?
Sarah, not really,
No?
because no, we had good training. I think it was about 6 months with the medic course as well, and the medic course was a highly specialized course. In fact, we were supposed to be used in base camps, but in my in my company, we were made fully operational. But, Rhodesians were quite a proud, I think a lot like you Americans, we were a really proud, unified nation. And fighting was part of our identity and part of our belonging. And it integrated you into the culture. And so, it wasn't as if I never remembered or thinking that I didn't want to go back. In no ways did I want to not be part of my country. It was where I belonged. But yeah, some people made a choice, and I don't judge it, but some people chose not to.
Okay, you know what? I appreciate you sharing that, because I'm trying to get like your mindset, going in. Um, what an intense position it was for all of you fighting this war. Then you get out, and I'm curious, what was the lowest time for you after you left the military service?
I often say that the first 60, the first 60 years of my life were at war, because I went through 5 immigrations, 2 marriages, one of which was pretty disastrous. It involved a lot of legal action. It was very stressful. And I often say to my wife now, when I look back, I feel that for most of the first 60 years, I was really trying to catch my breath. And I often felt that my time at war was probably the least of the impacts on me. Because there was just so much change and so much loss and so much having to adjust and adapt all the time. But I had some great adventures. I lived in England for a while. I tried to mountain bike to Israel with no map, which didn't work. In in Israel, I worked for the British Council. They started the British Council English Language Centre. I was selected for that. I got into marathon running and ultra marathon running. I rode across the desert from Tel Aviv to Eilat on a mountain bike with 4 others on road bikes. So I had some really amazing adventures. But I think my life was so much, excuse me, was so transitory because I was always changing. Things were ending. And I think it took a long time, till I eventually returned to Australia, where I'd immigrated in 1980. And when I arrived here, my government changed 1980. My government changed hands. I applied for a passport. I didn't get a passport. So I was stateless in Australia for the first 2 years until I got an Aussie passport in 1982. I can't go back to my country. I don't belong. And it doesn't exist. There's no such thing as Rhodesia anymore. But when I came back in 2000, another difficult adjustment was, again, a family thing. And that was really hard. There were some serious things that took the wind out of me. So I staggered through all of that. I don't know how at times. I think because I had running and, I was a meditator, so I'd sit for long hours meditating and, ate well as a vegan and I had all the protective devices. But it was only really about 10, 11 years ago when I met my wife that things began to settle. And I finally felt I was in an environment where I felt safe. A lot of it didn't feel safe for a long time.
So much transition. I mean, it's incredible when you hear about, the trials that our service members go through in transition. I think about yours. It's kind of like yours was on steroids, and I think about like all you're doing, like everything you poured into the book. It's so clear that you have a passion for helping our service members transition well because of everything that you've had to fight through, to find peace and feel resolved. And so I'm very curious, what was your hope? What is your hope for your story in sharing that in our book? What is the message that you're hoping to be able to share with other people that may be suffering in silence and listening to this right now?
I remember all the time that I felt incredibly alone. I didn't even have the language to share what I thought was happening inside me because it was a mix of from the war up, well past it. And I remember that sense of aloneness at times. And I think the core mission of my book was, I wish there was somebody I could have talked to who understood what it was like being at war. Because most people and most allied health professionals, and I saw a couple, had no clue. So they were working at symptomatic presentation and not really understanding me as a person and what things were like in me. And then after sitting for 22 years with the guys, I also sensed the same thing of needing to be understood and trying to find a place where it wasn't a clinical environment, but it was a place where the person sitting opposite you was absolutely attuned to who you were and understood the aspects that formed a veteran, the grief, loss of identity, belonging, purpose. And so the book was the product of 22 years of sitting with veterans and between us forming a language that grew from our territory. And it wasn't just me, it was the combination between us where I realized that everything I learned in the military and everything I learned in war, all the protocols that we used to take care of ourselves and each other, they could be adjusted and adapted to form a healing language that veterans went, I get it, and that made sense to them and helped them to transition into a positive place, but also heal. But also remember, it's like I say to veterans, first thing is a rescue mission. We need to go back and heal the wounded parts and bring the strengths forward. Because when you ask a veteran, would you ever leave somebody behind? Their first response is absolutely not. We'd sooner die than leave somebody behind. And then generally I'll say, well, how come you left yourself behind? Now, at that point, we're in the territory. They get it. And so the book for me was an opportunity, for one thing, for veterans to know, I can see myself in the book. It makes sense. And there's a map and a compass that can support me to transition forward while I'm getting all the support I need. But also, I feel incredibly strongly that there needs to be far more responsibility towards allied health professionals who are working with veterans to become familiar with the veteran territory before they even step foot into that room. It's not a clinical cold environment. It's not an environment where we have our protocols and we tell you what's wrong and we tell you what we're going to do to fix you and we administer questionnaires. I'm not saying all those things are not important, but when somebody enters the room and they start to talk about a mission and protocols and standard operational protocols and going back to rescue yourself and how you equate weapon cleaning to cleaning your stress and your tension and all the things that happen at a military level when you don't do it, like, a stoppage in a gun where the round gets stuck, which is like depression. I feel that if professionals can get that, it's not a substitute for the tools they use, but immediately they earn the right to enter the veterans' territory because they've demonstrated knowledge and understanding of the language and the story of the territory. So I'm hoping the book has two impacts, both on veterans that dwell with it and use the journaling thing to imprint it as part of their journey. So as I've often said, my book becomes their book, becomes the family's book, becomes the tribe's book as we share story, but also that it supports allied health professionals to do a good job. Well, it's not as if they're doing a bad job, but to do a better job.
That's great. I appreciate you bringing that up. You do hear that. You hear that people are not always culturally competent. They don't really understand maybe the veteran journey. There's some things that can be real deal breakers to where a veteran may never go back for therapy again. And it seems like a good time to remind people that, listen, if it is not a good fit, it just means it's not a good fit. Just leave and find somebody else. Try somebody else to be able to sit down with. I appreciate what you're bringing up, though, because it is a unique arena. You've been through things that a large majority has no clue about. We're so detached from the cost of war. And for you to go and see somebody who really doesn't understand, and maybe doesn't have the humility to ask, like you, to educate the clinician and then work from there, maybe a place of humility. Yeah, I can just, you hear the stories, you hear great stories and you hear hard stories, where it really stopped people from coming back to get the help and support that they need. But that's why I love how you articulated and broke down so many things in your own book. And that's why it's great to have you share your own story in this book, the Wounds to Wisdom book. Now, if somebody is actually, reading your story, listening to this podcast right now, what would be the first brave step that you can think of to go forward towards healing? Once they think, okay, there's hope. Now, what do I do? What would you suggest?
But it's like I often, when a bloke, I've worked mostly with men, from the trail edge of the World War II guys to the Vietnam boys and then the current guys. The first thing is we redefine the map. So the first thing I'll say to them is, let's talk about your perimeter defenses. What are the things that are coming in that are impacting on you? So it could be depression, it could be really bad eating habits, poor sleep, it could be relationship issues. So now we've identified the perimeter aspects that we need to take care of. Then it's the mission, the beginning of the mission is we need to go back, as I said, to rescue who you are, to heal the wounded parts and bring your strengths forward. So I'm not asking the guys to forget their time at war. I'm asking them to bring their strengths and never lose the veteran as they combine that part of them with a civilian. Then I talk to them about, right, in this journey to rescue yourself, let's look at your protocols around weapon maintenance. So we know with a weapon, you've got to clean the working parts, and they understand all of that. So those will be things like, let's look at are you keeping fit? What's your eating like? Exercise, sleep, nutrition. Then I talk to them about cleaning the barrel, the residue that gets in your barrel. There's a special device. You drop a weighted lead with a string and an oily rag through, and you put it through the barrel. And I explain to them that this is important in your life to clean your residue as you make this transition. Because if you don't, you'll get what we call the stoppage when the round gets caught in the weapon, and that is, depression and anxiety. Or we can get a runaway gun, which is when it fires on its own volition, and that means you're completely out of control. Or we get what they call the discharge, the weapon fires, accidental discharge. The weapon fires around off, and that's those sudden bursts of anger within your family. So now they get it. So now we have a rescue mission. We're looking at the pull-throughs, and they go away with a number of tools, whether it's breathing techniques, tapping techniques, just 20 minutes worth. So when they go home, they've got 20 minutes or 15 minutes to do something that we agree on and they agree on every day to ensure that weapon maintenance is effective as they progress forward. And we've already started to define their map and orientate their compass. The minute they have something to do, you've moved from the passenger seat of your vehicle to the driver's seat. It doesn't mean you're not still going through a dust storm, but you're in control. It's that simple to begin. We're not going into diagnostic depth, and I'm not throwing modalities or my modalities at them. We are creating an operation in which them and I, the veteran and myself, form a patrol to move backwards and then forwards. And that's it.
You break that down so clearly. I can imagine how a veteran would connect to that so well. And I think that's what they're looking for, isn't it? It's something that's very clear, that makes sense. Connection. What does the new mission look like? What does the next step look like? And I think your analogy with what they already understand is such a great way to do it. Barry, if people wanted to connect with you, how should they do that? Should they do that on LinkedIn, or is there a way to connect with you?
Yeah, LinkedIn's fine. They can get to LinkedIn. They can message me. Again, they can come to the Power of a Story and get the details there. That's probably the easiest way. I took down my website, so I'll put another one up at some point. But yeah, that's the easiest way at the moment. And then from there, if they wanted to talk, we can always open up communication. I'm happy always working on WhatsApp or Signal or some of the other things to have the conversation. I'm always ready for that. So yeah, it's always good to have a conversation because, Sarah, one tribe has one heart, and that heart is the story of people at service. And that's why the stories that you are creating will resonate with all our hearts across generations, because it doesn't matter the differences in the stories, it all beats with one heart. And as we connect our hearts across time and generations, we begin to heal. And that will be the power of the book.
Oh, I appreciate that. You articulate things so well. You connect all different kinds of people. You really bring people in to really be on the same page. Like you said, one heart. You've been such a great addition to the power of our story, to this book, Wounds to Wisdom. And I just want to encourage anybody out there, if you are suffering in silence, take that first step of courage. Think about the things that Barry has talked about today. Come join us at the Power of Our Story. Everybody is there to listen, to see you, to connect with you. Everybody has been in a very similar boat in that they have struggled and have navigated their way to a healing journey. So, Barry, I just want to thank you so much for everything that you do, everything that you bring to help people heal. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Sarah. Well, as we say, you are the mother of this tribe, and we love you. And thank you for everything you've done to bring us together. Because, you asked what's the first thing I would do with veterans? Join a tribe. When we go back into tribe, no matter how many years after the war, and we belong, at that point, we are already healing. So thank you.
Thank you, Barry. It's an honor. Appreciate it.